All right. Well, welcome everybody to the United Methodist Church of Johnstown, our Wesley's Own Words study, where we are looking at some of the early and in many ways the most important works of Wesley in who help us be who we are. And we're starting off by looking at the nature, design, and general rules of our united societies, and hopefully you've already listened to the first two episodes of this. If you haven't, I really suggest you go do that so you know what we are. But we're today going to pick up where we left off. We're into what is the first of the three rules. And these would be come to known as basically the three rules of Methodism. There's a rather popular book written, 15, almost 20 years ago now, called Three Simple Rules that are about this section. It's a very simple little brown book. But the first one is do no harm. And so last time we got about halfway through Wesley's list on do no harm. And just by way of a reminder, this is the first rule, because first thing we should always do is, stop making things worse, right? Whatever situation we find ourselves in, good, bad, or otherwise, first question we ask ourselves is is there any way that I am making things worse right now for myself or others? And maybe I should stop that. And is there a way to either reduce or, stop the harm? And so he says that's the first rule that any Methodist should follow, is that we should first avoid doing harm to ourselves or others. And then he goes on and talks about that which is most generally practiced. So he's specifically bringing up things that are generally practiced, he feels, in his time where he is living in his world, that maybe people are not entirely certain about or are not thinking of as harmful in the ways that Wesley would like them to. It's not an exhausted list, and it's not an exhausted list for all time. Again, I think last week we talked about the fact that, not murdering people is not on this list. Well, it's sort of assumed that you understand that murdering people causes harm and we shouldn't do it. So we got through the first half of that. And then we get into the second half of his list that is also kind of a mix between some very, very practical concerns that he has, and then some more kind of like theological or esoteric concerns that he has. And so the second half of the list starts off by the giving or taking things on usury, i.e. unlawful interest. Now, this Wesley's living at an interesting time. Kind of before this, interest in general, Christians doing anything on interest was considered not okay. And so, but there comes a time as technology increases and as the world progresses, and especially we get to John Wesley's time, the whole British Empire is really based on credit. It's people are borrowing money from, banks and other institutions. They have banks, banks exist in a way that we would recognize as banks, and before this they really didn't. So I wouldn't say everybody, but more people have access to credit than would have had credit before. There's a whole merchant class that pops up at this time. And so a lot of the expeditions that people are going on to explore far-flung places are economic expeditions. They're going to look for things they can bring back and sell. And so there's a lot of international trade happening in a way that really wasn't happening a whole lot before. And it wasn't just kings and queens funding this stuff. There was now this whole other group of bankers and merchants doing it. And the only way that makes sense for them is if they lend money on interest. So lending on interest itself is no longer considered completely taboo, but extraordinary interest, or interest that it says is unlawful, is a problem. And in our conversation in the class about this, we talked about things like payday lending that can sometimes have, high double-digit interest rates, 20, 30, 40, 50% interest. A lot of and then maybe the places it comes up that is not as commonly thought about, but a lot of buy here, pay here, car lots, where they're, charging a weekly payment because, a lot of times, especially the working poor, they get paid on a weekly basis. So they're able to offer a smaller payment because you're paying every week instead of every month. But if you really look into the terms of those deals around some of these, quote unquote financing for these cars, you can see what breaks down to some pretty hefty interest rates that are only revealed in the finest of fine print, right? So I think that's what Wesley's more talking about. Sometimes this does tune into unlawful. Some states and counties and other organizations actually have a cap on how much interest you can charge. So when he says unlawful interest, I mean, he's also talking about some more of the casual lending that might happen between people, or, I don't know if they would have called it loan sharking in Wesley's day, but he's definitely talking about that. But I think anything kind of becomes, when does something become a normal financial transaction, and when does it become usury? If it's a kind of lending that is designed to entrap people, right, into a cycle of debt that is very difficult to get out of. That is one of the biggest challenges laid at the feet of places like payday lending and those kind of places. The interest rates are so high that, by the time, you're basically forced to pay off, last week's loan with this week's paycheck, and then at the end of this week you're going to need another loan, and so it just starts this cycle. We live in a world now where it's standard for credit cards rates to be in the high teens, low 20s. You could argue that that's usury, but anything that's designed to catch you in a trap of debt is a problem. Of course, in Wesley's live in a time when there's things like debtor's prison, so that's a piece of it as well. It's also important that he talks about the giving or taking of things. So he doesn't want to participate on it in either side. We should not borrow. We should not be borrowers in an unfair situation as this, but we also shouldn't be lenders as well. We need to be thoughtful in that way. So no usury. Uncharitable or unprofitable conversation, particularly speaking evil of magistrates or of ministers. Uncharitable and unprofitable conversation is kind of Wesley's way of saying things like gossip or spreading rumors about people. Really anybody, is a problem. But he especially notes that this can happen, especially for magistrates, basically kind of elected officials, especially local elected officials, judges, people like that, and then ministers. He doesn't want people running around spreading rumors or, unfounded gossip or, whatever about really anybody. It's not okay, but then he calls out specifically these two groups because it's probably commonly practiced, right? I mean, it's not uncommon, and it hasn't been for a long time, to complain about your elected officials and your other leaders. Imagine that. I know it's a huge surprise, but turns out it's as common as Wesley's days it is now. And so he doesn't want us having uncharitable or unprofitable conversations in that regard. That is not to say that there cannot be criticism. But the question is, when you are providing or you are participating in criticism, is it constructive? Are you doing it out of a place of respect? Or are you criticizing to tear someone down, right? I think that's really the piece of he's worried about. It's like if your intention when raising your concern, whatever it may be, is to make the other person look bad or stupid or, tear them down or, whatever, whether that person is in a position of authority like a minister or a magistrate or just anybody in general, then you're not doing it right. If you're offering criticism because you think, they made a mistake, or you think that they could do something better than they are doing it, Wesley had no problem, if you read his letters, offering criticism to all sorts of people, often unrequested, and including his fellow ministers and magistrates. So, he had no problem, doing that. But I think he would argue, and you can kind of see there, he's still doing it out of a place in love and respect, and the idea that somebody, you can offer somebody something that will help them be better or do better than what they're doing. They may need some feedback they are themselves unable to see because we don't always see ourselves clearly. So it's not that we are, especially I think me as a pastor, it's not that I'm above criticism by any means. That's not what he's saying. Speaking evil is something more than that. It's about intentionally, trying to either use gossip or rumor or whatever, kind of these more aggressive ways of speaking about or to each other in a way that it has evil intent to basically tear somebody down, to belittle them, to berate them, that kind of stuff. So he says, don't do that. Then he says, doing to others as we would not they should do unto us. It's amazingly worded. Oh, how grammar has changed. This is the kind of the corollary to do unto others. Like the version of this we were used to hearing is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Basically, do for other people what you hope they would do for you. And I love that that's our default way of talking about it because it's a very proactive way of doing it, and really kind of more fits into the next section of the next rule, do good. And I love that phrasing of it, the do unto others, is a proactive one. It says we are actually meant to be actively engaged in the world and actively engaged in the process of blessing other people. But there's another version. There's another side of it is too, which is, doing to others as we would not they should do unto us. Basically, don't do things to people you don't want them to do to you. Is really what he's saying. And so basically don't harm, right? And so if there's something that you don't like, if there's a way of being treated or talked to or, whatever, if there's something that you yourself would not appreciate somebody else doing to you, then you should endeavor not to do it to other people. It seems a little obvious, and it's definitely one of those all-encompassing sayings, that can hide a lot of things under it. But, what I no doubt Wesley is clearly seeing is people treating others in a way they themselves would not want to be treated. So treating others with a lack of respect while demanding respect for themselves, whatever that is. And so he says, don't do that. So there's a not do side of things. There's a don't do harm to others, which really the whole section is about that. And then we get the list within the list. So this is the kind of final section of the do no harm section, and we get an additional line in colon. So we get the bulleted list within the bulleted list, where Wesley says, doing what we know is not for the glory of God as colon, and then he adds another collection of things. And the thing that kind of binds all these things together is that most of them unto themselves maybe not bad, or the more mild version of them might be okay, but we should avoid these things because they are not to God's glory. Kind of before now, we've just been talking about general practices that more affect our relationship with each other. So the prohibitions against drunkenness, fighting, quarreling, doing things on usury, slave holding, that's mostly about ways we harm our relationship with our neighbor, and we don't love our neighbor as well as we should. Now we're kind of getting to the love God section, and saying these are things that we don't do because they may harm our neighbor and they may harm ourselves, but they also harm our relationship with God. And so we try to do things we try not to do things that are not to God's glory, including putting on of gold and costly apparel. Now there's a couple of problems with the putting on of gold and costly apparel. One is in order to put on gold and costly apparel, you have to have it, which means you've expended some amount of your finances and your resources to acquiring golden jewelry, ostentatious golden jewelry, more than anything I would doubt, and costly apparel, which apparently was a thing long before there was Louis Vuitton and all the rest of it, before they were even born. Apparently we were still about putting on costly apparel, and in fact this is a quote from 1 Timothy, so all the way back in the first century there was still this problem of putting on gold and costly apparel. And so on one it is a misuse of resources in a way. If you were prioritizing the procurement of costly things to adorn yourself with, so that everyone can see how rich you are, then that's a problem. We don't do that. But the other thing is, it's also about it's also about what's your purpose, right? I mean, in the Bible, it talks specifically about putting on gold, jewelry and costly apparel when coming to church. And, so the question is, when you come to church, who's the center of attention, you or that which you came to worship? Right. And if you're showing up, dressed to the nines and, with your fur coat or, whatever it is, then, who are you putting at the center of that experience of worship, yourself or God, and who should it be? Right. And are you drawing attention to yourself with your gold and costly apparel? In order, and in so doing, are you taking attention away from that which it should be? Namely God. So, that's really, the problem there. Not taking such diversions as cannot be used in the name of the Lord Jesus. Now, we actually had a rich discussion about this in class today. When we talk about diversions, notice it says such diversions. All diversions aren't bad. Sometimes we need diversions. Like sometimes we need a little time and we're like, look, I need a diversion from my life for a little bit. I will tell my kids, sometimes I'm like, I just need to go be mindless for a little while. And I watch some kind of random car show on YouTube just to kind of like chill. Or, you take a walk around the block, or, read, some book that's, not a book for work, but just a book because you like it, or, watch some TV show or, some movies, or whatever. That's not necessarily, a bad thing. Sometimes we need diversions because sometimes oftentimes life is hard. We got a lot of hard stuff we're dealing with. And you just can't think about everything all the time, all at once, right? It's just exhausting. You just can't do it. And so there are times when we I need to, do something else right now. And I need to, find some other way to be, right now. I need to find something to divert myself. So diversions themselves aren't bad. It's diversions that cannot be used in the name of Lord Jesus Christ, right? So, going to the movie, to, be entertained for a little while, I don't think is a problem for anybody and shouldn't be a problem for anybody. But going to the strip club, maybe not so much, right? I mean, so, even when we are, taking time for ourselves, right? What we call self-care now, all the time, are we doing, but even when we do that, we are taking the opportunity to love ourselves as we are instructed to do and love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves. We cannot take it so far, that we are, loving ourselves to the detriment of the other things we are called to love. And then to kind of go along with that, he says, the singing those songs or reading those books which do not tend to the knowledge of love of God. Don't tend to the knowledge or love of God. So I love it that it's those. Singing songs, fine, just not those songs. Right? Reading books, fine, just not those books. And they didn't have it back then, but if they did, you can be assured that Wesley would add those TV shows and those movies and those websites on the internet. And what are the those? The those are the ones that don't tend to the knowledge or the love of God. All right? So God loves us, and God cares about us. So it's not that it's not like the only thing you can read, is the Bible or books about the Bible. It's not the only thing you watch on TV is, TV shows about, Jesus, right? Those are fine, though actually some of them are really bad and really not worth your time. But some of those are fine. He's not saying you can only do that. But what he is reminding us is that there are songs and there are books and TV shows and movies and stuff, which, instead of just being entertaining, can actually, not be constructive to our lives. And when he talks about it specifically about the knowledge or love of God. Basically, again, you go back to the check. Is this helping me love God, love neighbor, love myself more, or the opposite of that? Is this thing I am watching or consuming actually, teaching me more to hate my neighbor than to love them? Or is this, thing I am doing, constructive and helpful and useful to my life and the other people, or is it not? And while a lot of us, probably are not, consuming a lot of things that are outwardly like hateful and evil and things like that. There's a lot of trash out there, and there's a certain point at which even consuming a bunch of trash, even if it isn't directly like, prejudicial or anything like that, is still not great. Like, you can't live on a diet of it. And I think one of the things we talked about in the class was like, if the magazine that you're looking at is one they sell right at the checkout counter at the grocery store with a giant like crazy headline on it that's meant to tell you, some awful thing about a celebrity, that might be one of those magazines that John's wearing, telling us about. Or, I mean, I don't know if there's anything necessarily wrong with, things like romance books. My mom used to own a used bookstore when we lived in Miles City, and there was a whole romance section, and I never really perused all that many of them, but I did randomly open a couple, and there was some stuff in there that was very explicit that I think might, qualify as one of those books. So, we should recognize that not everything around us is good for us, right? There's a scripture about that. All things are, permissible, but not all things are advisable, more or less. It's like, yeah, you can read whatever you want. Not everything you read is beneficial to yourselves and others. So be careful about that. Then he talks about softness and needless self-indulgence. So again, you get that sense of self-indulgence isn't necessarily the problem. Needless self-indulgence, right? So self-care is fine. Sometimes we just need a break. We need a massage. We need a trip to Dairy Queen, whatever it is, like just to, give us that little boost to get through the day. We may think of that as self-indulgence, but why are we doing it? Are we doing it so that we can, help get ourselves through a hard time and maintain engaged and productive in the world and all that kind of stuff? That's one thing. Needless self-indulgence, right? Are we so prioritizing our own personal, comfort and pleasure that is coming at the cost of other things, right? Like, are we prioritizing our self-indulgence so much? Are we prioritizing, we're not able to, or we don't have the time, or we're not seeing the opportunity to do the harder things when God asks us to. Then we go into laying up treasures on earth. I don't think he's against savings or 401ks or anything like that. That's not what that's about. But there is this sense of you can't take it with you, right? And so if you are so fixated on making money that to the exclusion of everything else, are you so fixated on making money and laying up treasures that you're not able to be a good parent or a good child or a good member of the community or, a part of the church or, really be about all that extra stuff that God calls on each and every one of us to do? If you're so busy making money, so busy laying up treasures, so concerned with, how big your house is and how big your TV is and all that kind of stuff that, that's what you care about and you prioritize it over taking care of yourself again and loving God, loving neighbor, and loving yourself. It all comes back to that. If laying up treasure is more important to you than those, then that's laying up treasure, right? Versus just, there's nothing necessarily wrong with being a prudent spender or being good at saving or whatever, as I was saying. And then finally, borrowing without a probability of paying or taking up goods without a probability of paying for them. That was fairly obvious, but again, we're in the very early stages of things like, credit being extended to kind of more and more normal people. Whether that's, credit to, again, build a boat and mount an expedition, or whether that's, credit at, the store or somebody's stand. It wasn't uncommon for people to give credit, to people, at their stands or in their little shops, or whatever, that you would, and then you'd settle up, maybe when the harvest came in, or, you'd settle up at another time. That was kind of coming into things for the first time, that was kind of a thing that was happening. Well, don't borrow, big or small, unless you reasonably believe you are going to pay it back. Because really, honestly, if you borrow something from somebody, quote unquote, and then even though in your heart you're probably not going to be able to pay it back, well, then that's really indistinguishable from stealing, right? I mean, it's time delayed stealing. And so Wesley's like, don't do that. And it was a common problem at that point, because people were not financially, there was new forms of credit being offered to people. I mean, not quite like a Visa card like we're used to today, but there were additional opportunities for people to participate in the economy, through borrowing, that they hadn't had before. So they're very unsophisticated. Most people were very unsophisticated about it. And on one hand, you find yourself taken advantage of, which, don't want. But on the other hand, you can find yourself inadvertently getting, or even inadvertently. So is vertently a word? I don't know. But you can see, on purpose or not, getting yourself in over your head as far as that goes. Now, so that's the end of the list. But again, I want to go back to what we talked about at the beginning real quick at the end here. Yeah, that's what I meant. This is his list of generally practiced. So this isn't an exhaustive list for all time. Some of these we have to translate into our world today because we don't live in the same world Wesley did, and these things aren't as generally practiced. And there's this whole things that, are probably generally practiced today that Wesley would consider harmful. Obviously, the internet wasn't a thing, so how we, participate in community or participate on the internet and all that is a thing. The other thing that I noticed is completely absent here is any sense of what we kind of call today environmentalism, right? I mean, we're talking right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so they're not really thinking about this stuff then. But we know that, the world's got a couple hundred years of some really dirty air in front of it, and polluted water, and deforestation, and, all these things that we're now kind of dealing with, the other side of, have been dealing with for the last several decades, right? Like, we don't see a lot of acid rain anymore, and that's a good thing, but that's because we had to pass rules and laws about, what you could put into the atmosphere, because what you put up there tends to come back down, on you at some point. And we dealt with a lot of like pollution in our waterways, famously the river that caught on fire, in the 70s, right? I mean, that doesn't happen as much anymore because we've taken measures and said, okay, there's a limit to what you can put into the river. Well, in Wesley's days, they were putting everything into the river, and they were putting everything in the sky and burning everything they could as fast as they could. Not knowing that there'd be any consequence to it down the line. So, I would say that is something that we have to be concerned about. Generally practiced harmful activities. Like, how are we caring for, God's creation around us? How do we care for the earth, right? That is a whole concern. And there's, people from different ideas and political backgrounds have different ideas about what that looks like or can look like or should look like or how important it is, or, or whatever. I'm like, fine. But, we do know that, we used to have a whole lot more trees in the United States than we have now because we cut them all down or we burned them all down. And maybe that wasn't always the best idea. So we know we as human beings can have an impact on our planet and our environment around us, and we need to be concerned about that. So I would say that's a whole section about not doing harm that, wouldn't have been top of mind in Wesley's day. They were more looking at what they could get out of their earth than their care of it. But that today we would look at and go, oh, that's something we probably need to think about. How do we do that? And somebody else brought up this idea of, asking how much we ask of others, right? Like asking more of others than we are willing to do ourselves. I think it's another way to spin that do unto others, right? Like, are we asking other people to work harder or do more? Are we shifting the burden from us to other people so that we can do less, right? Are we asking others to do more so that we, more than we ourselves are willing to do? Like, oh, that's going to be somebody else's problem. That's probably not good either. That's probably falls under this category of harm as well. All right. Well, next week we're going to get into the next two rules. There's probably going to be 2 more weeks on this book on the general rules. So next week we're going to actually finally talk about doing good and then staying connected to God and kind of wrap up this whole little section. So I hope you will join for that. Thank you for being a part of this. These things are always a lot of fun. And until we see each other again, until you tune in again, have a great day.